Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. All the pundits say that the Australian federal election will be called soon, so it's a good time to talk about caretaker conventions, which no doubt will become the subject of some kind of controversy in the course of the election campaign. But what are they? Well, they are conventions about how a government should restrain its activities during periods when it's not fully accountable. For example, the caretaker conventions apply when a government loses a vote of no confidence but continues to govern until a new government is formed. The conventions also apply when a government is dismissed and a new government is appointed pending the holding of an election. So in 1975, after the dismissal of the Whitlam government, Malcolm Fraser was appointed to lead a caretaker government under even stricter than normal caretaker conditions until the people could decide in an election who should govern. Most commonly, however, the caretaker conventions apply after Parliament is dissolved for an election and until either it's clear that the incumbent government has won and therefore can keep governing, or until a new government is formed. That means that the length of the caretaker period is not known in advance. It could be just for the length of the election campaign, with the outcome being clear on the election night. Or it could be that there is a hung parliament and maybe 4 or 5 weeks more of caretaker period while the question of who forms a new government is being determined. To understand how the caretaker conventions apply, you first need to understand why they apply. There are 2 basic reasons. First, once Parliament, and here I really just mean the House of Representatives, is dissolved, the government can no longer be called to account before it. It should therefore be more restrained in its actions while not under parliamentary scrutiny. Second, as a matter of fairness, the government should not be entering into binding commitments immediately before an election if they would burden an incoming government. It's unfair for an outgoing government to fill important statutory positions with its own people to make life harder for an incoming government, or to enter contracts that commit a new government to a policy that it opposes. Historically, these conventions evolved from notions of being a good chap and behaving honourably. It was seen as poor form and just not cricket to exploit one's remaining moments of power after having lost an election or when one was at risk of losing one. An early example, before there were settled conventions, occurred in Canada in 1896. After the federal government of Sir Charles Tupper was defeated at a general election, it remained in office in a caretaker capacity pending the formation of a new government. During those last few days, it advised the Governor-General to appoint new senators and judges. The Governor-General refused, noting that such appointments were made for life and should be left to the incoming government to decide upon. In Australia, these conventions were first formally set out by Prime Minister Menzies in a letter to his ministers about how they should behave prior to the 1951 election. It later became standard practice for a formal guidance about the caretaker conventions to be sent to all ministers and also published to public servants before an election. These days, it's published by the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet on its website, and the latest version was published in December 2024 in anticipation of the forthcoming 2025 election. In 2010, when the federal election resulted in a hung parliament, additional guidelines for post-election consultations with independent members were also issued by the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. What are the constraints that are imposed by these conventions? Well, there are 3 main ones. During a caretaker period, the government must avoid 1. Making major policy decisions that are likely to commit an incoming government, 2. Making significant appointments, and 3. Entering into major contracts or undertakings, such as entering into a treaty or another international agreement, or even a new grant scheme. Whether a decision, appointment or policy is major is of course a matter of judgment. In making these assessments, consideration is given to whether it's likely to be controversial, whether it's a matter of contention between the government and the opposition, as well as the cost of the decision and its impact upon future resources and policies. If decisions cannot reasonably be deferred during the caretaker period, the government can consult with the opposition to try to achieve a consensus on the matter. For example, after the 1999 Victorian state election, when there was a period of uncertainty about who would form a government, it was necessary to finalise a major hospital contract or penalties would have applied. It was dealt with by way of consultation between the government, the opposition and the public servants to reach an agreed position. The conventions, however, only require consultation. There's no ability for the opposition to use this as a form of veto over government actions. Governments retain their full legal powers. Both the government and the opposition can still, of course, make election commitments about future actions. And that happens all the time during election campaigns. The caretaker conventions only apply to actions taken within the caretaker period which have an effect, rather than some kind of promise for a future action. The caretaker conventions also do not apply to decisions that have been made and actions taken before the caretaker period commenced, even if they're only announced after it has commenced. Although that's obviously unwise because it does cause a bit of a controversy. So, what are some examples where issues about the application of caretaker conventions have arisen? In 1968, in South Australia, the Dunstan government advised the Queen, through the British government, as occurred in those days, to appoint a new state governor. And it did that during the caretaker period, just a few days before the state election was held. The British government and the palace together decided to defer taking any action upon that advice until after the election had occurred. As Dunstan's government lost the election, it was left to the new government to decide whether to proceed with that appointment, and it chose not to do so. It instead advised that somebody else be appointed as the governor of the state. In 1993, the Keating Labor government signed a 5-year Medicare funding deal for hospitals moments before the caretaker conventions commenced. It was criticised by the opposition for doing so, as the agreement would commit any incoming government and would run for 5 years, which is longer than a parliamentary term. As it was signed before the caretaker period commenced, it was not a breach of those caretaker conventions, although arguably it did defy the spirit of those conventions by binding an incoming government. The Prime Minister justified it by noting that the states wanted the certainty and the stability of such an agreement, rather than facing the unpredictability of what may be done by a new government. As the Labor Party actually won that election, it didn't turn out to be a particular problem. In 2004, the Howard coalition government, during the pre-election caretaker period, sent SAS officers to rescue 2 Australians who'd been kidnapped in Iraq. The government correctly pointed out that its decisions had no binding effects on a future government, and its actions were consistent with a pre-existing policy on kidnappings, which had been approved long before the caretaker period began. While its actions were controversial, they didn't appear to breach the caretaker conventions. Separate rules have developed on the fair use of the public service and public resources before and after elections. Now, technically, these are not actually part of the caretaker conventions because they concern self-restraint by ministers. The imposition of these separate constraints on public servants actually finds its basis in other sources, such as the Public Service Act 1999 and the APS Code of Conduct. But to the extent that they address the issue of fair behaviour during elections, they are these days lumped together with the caretaker conventions, and they appear in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet's guidance on caretaker conventions. And they include that the Australian Public Service must remain apolitical in its conduct, and secondly, that the Australian Public Service must avoid the use of public resources to advantage a particular political party. Government advertising is also restricted during the caretaker period to those matters that are necessary and which do not highlight the role of ministers or promote the achievements or policies of the government. Advertising on electoral matters by the Australian Electoral Commission does continue, as may also any advertisements dealing with necessary things like public health or emergencies. But it is common for governments to try to get the advantage of using public funds for advertisements that they think will make voters think favourably of them at election time. In 2013, the Rudd Labor government was criticised by the opposition for breaching the caretaker conventions by running advertisements within Australia about asylum seekers not being settled in Australia. The opposition was happy for those ads to run in overseas countries as a source of information and deterrence, but it regarded their publication within Australia as partisan during an election campaign and therefore in breach of the caretaker conventions. Opposition spokesperson Scott Morrison called it, quote, a shameless and desperate grab for votes, with the government spending taxpayers' money to advertise to the vote people rather than the boat people. Departmental websites are also reviewed during the caretaker period to remove recent material which contains negative references to the opposition or which promotes government policy. Purely factual material can remain, including costings on policies. Public servants have to be quite careful about not being used for political purposes during election campaigns. The last federal election provided a classic example of this. On the morning of election day in 2022, a boat of asylum seekers was intercepted in Australian waters. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, wanted to use this as a political campaign point during a press conference that he held after he'd voted that morning. The Office of the Minister for Home Affairs, at the request of the Prime Minister's office, directed her department to publish a statement on its website about the interception of the boat, despite the fact that such matters were ordinarily kept confidential until the operation was completed and asylum seekers had been returned home. Public servants were also requested to email the announcement to a list of selected journalists and to use the Australia Border Force's Twitter account to spread news about it. After some consideration, the public servants published a factual statement about the boat interception. It was later explained that this was because they were required by law to obey the direction of a minister, but they refused to amplify it by dropping it to journalists or publicising it on social media, as this would be partisan in nature and breach their obligations to be apolitical. Now, if you read the subsequent report about what actually happened, which sets out the increasingly frantic texts between the participants, you can see the pressure that was imposed on public servants. The Prime Minister's office wanted it to appear that journalists were raising an officially reported incident at the press conference, rather than acting at the bidding of the Prime Minister's office on the basis of an unauthorised security leak. The texts go as follows. Minister's office. Is it live? Prime Minister is speaking. Department. I'm refreshing. Minister's office. So are we. What on earth is the issue? Department. It always takes a few minutes to go live. I've no idea how it works, but we can't influence it. We're going to call IT. Minister's office. A lot of people are furious. Department. Nothing we can do. Legitimately nothing. So my sincere apologies. Well, we've all been there, so I can empathise with the poor public servant, although I rather secretly hope they were actually delaying pressing the button to make it go live in a little bit of revenge for being used in this particular way. Anyway, before the announcement was publicly released, a journalist did, surprise, surprise, ask about non-existent reports on the interception of a vessel. The Prime Minister then said that he could confirm its interception, and he added, quote, "I've been here to stop this boat. But in order for me to be there to stop those that may come from here, you need to vote Liberal and Nationals today," unquote. 2 minutes later, the official announcement went up on the website. The Liberal Party then sent mass texts about it to voters and spread it on social media. The boat, however, did not rescue the Morrison government, which lost the election. Now, finally, what's the status of these caretaker conventions and who polices them? The caretaker conventions are not laws and are not legally binding or enforceable. You can't go to a court to challenge the validity of the government's actions that may breach them. As conventions, they're accepted by political actors as applicable and politically binding rules of behaviour. There is bipartisan support that they should be obeyed. However, governments still retain their full legal powers throughout the caretaker period. And this is really important because there could be some kind of massive emergency that needs to be dealt with using those powers. Who enforces the conventions? Well, at the public service level, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet provides ultimate guidance on how those conventions operate. And if public servants breach the Code of Conduct or the requirements of the Public Service Act, then they can face disciplinary action. When it comes to ministers, it's supposed to be the Prime Minister who imposes the conventions and makes sure that there's compliance with them, but this doesn't tend to work when the desire for political advantage overcomes the desire for propriety. If the Governor-General is needed to officially approve an action or sign a document, he or she may defer doing so until after the election. Certainly, those Governors-General who have previously been ministers have tended to take the caretaker conventions quite seriously. They include Sir Paul Hasluck on the Coalition side and Bill Hayden on Labor side, who both policed compliance with the caretaker conventions through the Federal Executive Council. Otherwise, enforcement remains a political matter, with the opposition and the media raising a ruckus if they think that the conventions have been breached, and it's then up to voters who have the ultimate say at the ballot box on what they actually think about it. Thank you once again for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and as always, I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.